Hey there, I'm Nicki Traikos of Life I Design. I am a calligrapher and a watercolorist, and in this video, I'm going to talk to you all about how to create that perfect flow of watercolor paint so that you can paint easily and smoothly and enjoy that flow and that process. A little too groovy? I kind of get into that watercolor process. Anyway, I'm glad you're here. Let's get started playing around with watercolors. Let's wake up these dried watercolors and show you how much water you really need for your watercolors to have nice texture when you finish painting them. Also, so that you can move your watercolor puddle easily and just create more advanced or professional or intermediate looking watercolor pieces. So I've dipped my brush. I'm using a round, Princeton round number 8. So it has a nice thick barrel on it, and I'm dipping it in clean water a couple of times just to start waking up this dried paint. So I used a palette that has some paint colors already in it, so you can see how much that paint has changed. It's really nice and flowy now. It looks kind of thick. What I want you to do at this point is to load up your brush. So I have a nice amount of watercolor paint on that brush. And we're going to maybe take off a bit of the excess and lay that color down to see what it looks like. Okay, so I feel like that's a really nice mix. So again, the actual watercolor itself has a bit of flow and movement to it. It's not super drippy, but the opacity is really nice for me. So I do have a little bit of variation. There is some nice darker spots there as well as lighter spots. So I'll just do that again without re-dipping my brush to see how intense the watercolor is. So I know by doing a few test strokes that this is a really nice mix of water in my watercolor puddle. So knowing how much water to use when you're mixing your paint is really trial and error. If I were to dip my brush into the water and not reload it in the paint here, I'll just wipe off a bit of the excess. I should have some residual paint on my brush that I can use, and by adding just a few additional strokes, dabbing in, this is wet on wet here when we dab in, what that's doing is that's encouraging the leftover paint that you really can't see on the brush, but it's encouraging that water and that paint to drop onto our paper. The paper is cotton based, so it'll soak up the water from our brush. And look at how much more paint there is in that brush. Let's do that again. So I'll go ahead and create a stroke. I can see that it's drying up pretty well, but I'm just going to see how much more water I can encourage to come out of this brush. Again, dabbing, allowing that water to come out of my brush and that paint to flow onto the page. Okay, so when you have a nice opaque mix of watercolor, on your palette and you're able to really soak that up and saturate your brush, you'll be able to paint some beautiful strokes that are quite opaque and rich and have interest to them that you can start building on from there. Okay, so if you don't want this opacity in your watercolor to start with, almost looks like a petal, let's just go with it. I'll go ahead and dab, that's called wet on wet. Then what you can do is just add more water. So you can either add more water to your puddle, continuing it to mix around, or go ahead and load your brush with as much paint as you can from your palette. You can even dip it in the water, wiping off the excess here, and then go ahead and create more of a loose, less saturated puddle. Okay, here's another little, looks like a petal, and then you can always dab in. So just let the paint guide you. So wherever it chooses to land, I don't even want to push that. I really love how that tip of that stroke is nice and light. And if I dab and create some more intensity, maybe I'll bring it around here, I can encourage the paint to flow and move wherever there is that wet spot. Okay, so again, really nice and flowy. You can see there by my petal. Go ahead and make sure I saturate my brush because it does tend to stiffen up and start to dry up. Go ahead and move my palette over so you can see this. We'll go ahead and, there you create the beginnings of a petal. And then just using the tip to encourage whatever paint is left in my brush. And you'll be amazed at how much paint and water these watercolor brushes hold. Okay, so that's how you would mix your watercolor paint if you're using a dry palette, maybe a palette that you just continue to use again and again. If you want to change the intensity without redipping my brush into the water, go ahead and let's create another petal up here. Okay, and just bringing it around. There you go. So you can see that it is more transparent, and then I can encourage the rest, just pushing down on that brush, encouraging the rest of that water to flow. Okay, maybe we'll even try to do one more. Just want you to see how much water is stored in this brush. So I haven't redipped, I haven't done any of that. Again, just to show you. So really the best way to learn how much water you need is to practice. Okay, so start off making sure your petal is nice and fluid. I was trying to say fluid or flowy. That was funny. I'm not going to edit that out because that happens. So make sure your water petal is nice and fluid or flowy, and then go ahead and see what the opacity looks like. Okay. And then what you can even do, let me show you another little thing here. So without any paint on this brush of mine, I'm just going to lay down a few strokes, and then I can come over here, really saturate that brush, and then let's just drop in some watercolor. Okay, and then you can move it around. You can play with the intensity. Maybe you have too much water. Too much water is a problem. I do it a lot. Sometimes when you're working intuitively, you're not even thinking. So I'm just using the brush, wiping it off, and just picking up this watercolor, moving it around, maybe controlling where I want it to lay. So I have some nice lighter spots here, but then there's also some nice opaque spots when it dries. Okay, the beauty again with watercolor is you want that interesting texture to happen when it's drying. You want to be able to control somewhat your water flow, but then you want the water to flow where it wants to go as well. So I can go back even to these ones and remove a little if I feel like it's flat, if I want a little bit more texture. But personally, my painting style is I love to do more single strokes and then just let the watercolor behave as it chooses. So I like to just let the petals, with a little bit of control, sort of start and stop where they need, and then I can always go in and fill a little bit or push those petals around if I want a little bit more interest. And this, these little darker bits and darker petals, again, will dry with so much texture and interest that it'll take very little effort on your part to have a really cool finished looking watercolor piece. Okay, so I hope that helps. Remember, you want it to be flowy, not too watery. I've given you some tips for removing if you have too much water, and then you can always go over a light spot and add a little bit more pigment if you need while it's still wet. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you've come away with some tips and tricks when it comes to creating that perfect watercolor consistency, and maybe I've even inspired you to pick up that watercolor brush again and again so that you can grow your practice, enjoy this really meditative and fun medium as we paint watercolor together. So if you like this video, please click like, comment below if you've practiced anything that I've taught you in this tutorial, and be sure to subscribe so you get notified when I publish my next videos, which is about once a week, every Sundays, and maybe coming at you a little bit more if I've got something special to teach you. So thank you again for spending this time with me, and cheers to being creative.